Here's how U.S. Navy deploys and trains its sailors. Six years after the U.S. Navy rolled out its optimized fleet response plan for manning, training and deploying its ships over a 36-month cycle, many of the key promises have failed to materialize, according to public statements from Navy officials and experts. The plan, known as O-FRP inside the Navy, had lofty goals of a more stable deployment cycle that would give sailors and families predictability, would fully man ships at the beginning of their deployment workup cycles and would allow for better planning for maintenance cycles in the public and private shipyards, tamping down on delays getting ships back to the fleet. But according to recent statements by Navy officials, O-FRP has been failing on multiple fronts, cracking under the weight of delays in the shipyards and manning shortages on the waterfront. Now, according to senior Navy leaders, the Service and Defense Department are reviewing the plan with a critical eye, and changes could be coming to a program that, on its face, has struggled to produce its intended outcomes. That means revisions to how the Navy mounts, trains and deploys its forces could be in the offing. The Navy's top officer, Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Michael Gilday, said in recent comments that he was taking a look at every aspect of the program to see if there were places that could perform better. "We are taking a look at our force generation model," Gilday said at the recent Surface Navy Association Symposium. "Fleet Forces is doing a study right now. We have hired the third party to take a look at O-FRP, digging into how we maintain. Digging into how we train." O-FRP is the construct that governs how the U.S. Navy deploys and trains its sailors. It starts with a maintenance phase, where ships get fixed and maintained ahead of entering into a deployment workup cycle. Then sailors enter the basic phase, where they start qualifying for the various shipboard functions such as fighting a major fire, operating the combat system correctly and safely navigating the ship. Then ships enter an advanced and integrated phase where they learn high-end warfighting tactics and bring the strike group together to fight as a unit. That's followed by deployment, followed by a roughly 14-month period of elevated readiness called the sustainment phase. In all, it adds up to 36 months. At the outset, it was built as a way to drive down costs by increasing predictability and give sailors most stable and predictable schedules. O-FRP has been developed to enhance the stability and predictability for our sailors and families by aligning carrier strike group assets to a new 36-month training and deployment cycle, the Fleet Forces Command wrote in a 2014 blog coinciding with the rollout. Beginning in fiscal year 15, all required maintenance, training, evaluations and a single 8-month deployment will be efficiently scheduled throughout the cycle to drive down costs and increase overall fleet readiness. The Navy changed the 8-month deployment to 7 months on the orders of then Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Jonathan Greener, but the basic premise of a more predictable, more affordable and better manned Navy for sailors was the plan's central premise. But 6 years since the rollout, the Navy has struggled to achieve what it set out to do. Gilday said he was not optimistic he'd find many efficiencies in the training and maintenance phases, but he may be able to gain some efficiency and availability out of what the Navy calls its sustainment phase, meaning the period of time after a ship deploys that it maintains a high state of readiness to be able to surge in a crisis. But doing so would mean sending sailors who just reunited with families after 7+ months of deployment back underway. Grady said, "The fundamentals of O-FRP should be upheld, even if they make changes to adapt to the factors that have undermined it." But since its inception, Fleet Forces has been reluctant to make significant changes to O-FRP, even as facts stacked up against the plan, said a retired Navy 3-star with close knowledge of O-FRP and its early development. "Any plan with assumptions that prove to be untrue must be altered," the 3-star said. O-FRP had several key assumptions that proved themselves wrong: set maintenance time frames, deployment manning levels at the start of basic phase, and equipment configuration control within the carrier strike group, to name a few. They all proved to be faulty assumptions, yet Navy marched on as if all the assumptions proved true. None panned out as planned. A fatal mistake to any plan, yet O-FRP marched on undeterred by the facts of its failed assumptions, hence the failure to meet the original promise of O-FRP. Is O-FRP broken? Chief among the factors that have put O-FRP on the rocks is the Navy's inability to plan and execute maintenance in a way that will get all the ships in a carrier strike group to both start and finish their maintenance cycles simultaneously, a critical assumption built into O-FRP. Since assuming his post, CNO Gilday has lamented the poor track record on maintenance and argued it's impossible to keep the fleet in good running order with compounding delays. "We are getting 35 to 40% of our ships out of maintenance on time. That's unacceptable," Gilday said at the USNI Defense Forum in December. "I can't sustain the fleet I have with that kind of track record." Grady agreed, acknowledging that maintenance has been a thorn in the side of O-FRP. "We may flex and adjust to reflect the realities, and I think it's fair to say maintenance is the #1 driver of that," Grady said. But while Grady acknowledges O-FRP may need to change, it bears noting that Fleet Forces Command was thoroughly warned that getting several ships in and out of maintenance at the same time could prove unworkable. Then NAVSEA head Vice Admiral William Hillarides told USNI News in January 2015 that getting ships to come out of the yards simultaneously would be difficult. "The challenge to me is, let's say you want 4 destroyers in a battle group, all to come out at the same time in one port? That's a real challenge," Hillarides told USNI News. The current head of NAVSEA's ships program, who at the time was in charge of the Regional Maintenance Center enterprise, backed up his boss to USNI News, saying it would be particularly challenging in places with less infrastructure. "Your big rub there is, the challenge of O-FRP is, all those ships, in a carrier strike group, they go through maintenance together, they go through training together and they deploy together," said Rear Admiral William Gallamy. "So, what our challenge is to be able to take all that work from all those ships and try to schedule it for roughly about the same time, and to get all that work done on time. So that's our challenge." Now, in a port like Norfolk or San Diego, we have big shipyards, a lot of people, a lot of ships. You can kind of absorb that type of workload. When you go to Mayport, they've got like 10 ships down there, and typically cannot work on more than 1 or 2 destroyers at a time, he told USNI. Gallany said that fleet forces would have to be responsive to the shipyards because at least that way they could plan for delays. "They know if they give us all this work at one time, it's going to go along anyway," he told USNI, so they'd rather be able to plan that and at least know when they're getting the ship back, as opposed to, "Nope, we're not going to talk to you, you've got to go do it, and then the ships go long because we don't have enough people to do the work." Deployment extension blues. It's also notable that O-FRP did not help the sailors and families of the Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group when the carrier scheduled to relieve it in the Arabian Gulf, dead in the middle of a crisis with Iran, suffered a casualty to its electrical distribution system, delaying the group's deployment. Gilday in his remarks at SNA said he extended Abraham Lincoln because he did not want to dip into contingency forces. Contingency forces are generated by the sustainment phase in O-FRP, a period where the Navy holds a carrier strike group in a state of elevated readiness after returning from deployment to be used as a surge force. "There was a casualty with another carrier and I couldn't get another carrier behind her very quickly," Gilday acknowledged in comments. "I could have accelerated other carriers. I could have gone into that next readiness bin, the contingency response forces, and we could have pulled those forces forward." The Navy's failure to relieve the Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group on time resulted in one of the longest deployments of a carrier group since the Vietnam War, according to USNI News. And while a string of mechanical issues with the aircraft carriers has exacerbated the issues, the net result is that 6 years after O-FRP was announced, the sustainment phase did not produce a ready carrier group for Lincoln's relief. The lengthy Abraham Lincoln deployment raises questions about whether the Navy is adequately funding the sustainment phase of O-FRP, said Brian Clark, a senior aide to former Chief of Naval Operations Greenert during O-FRP's development, who is now a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. Extending ships on deployment seems in part because they are not willing to pay for ships in the sustainment phase of O-FRP to maintain readiness, Clark said. If you maintain a bunch of ships ready in the sustainment phase, just waiting around home port to be called up, you could bring one of them out and the need to extend ships on deployment wouldn't exist. You'd just replace them. But clearly the Navy isn't paying for that sustainment period to maintain the fleet at that high level because there aren't ships available to replace those reaching the end of deployment or replace ships unexpectedly off deployment. You just don't have that flexibility that O-FRP was designed to provide. The expense of maintaining that readiness over 14 months of sustainment was well known at the time, Clark said. We all knew that was expensive and would be subject to financial constraints, he said. This, too, was something senior Navy leaders warned about in 2015 during the early implementation of O-FRP. In comments at an engineering conference in 2015, then Fleet Forces maintenance boss said there was no funding available for a lengthy sustainment phase. I call it sustainment opportunity because right now it's not funded, said Rear Admiral Richard Berkey, then Director of Fleet Maintenance for U.S. Fleet Forces, according to a USNI News report. In order to be able to keep those ships sustained after they come back from deployment, which is pretty much when they're maximized on their readiness, we would have to invest a lot more dollars both in the training side of the house and in the people side of the house in order to keep those sailors on board, keep the team together, keep them trained and proficient. Then Navy Air Boss Vice Admiral Mike Shoemaker agreed with Berkey, saying the longest he'd seen a carrier strike group retain its deployment readiness was 5 months.